He has two passions in life: to work with young people and to solve industry-related problems. I've known Louw for 10 years, and over this time, it is clear that he has the remarkable talent to integrate different sciences. And this is, of course, evident in his research output. So in essence, he explores all factors that influence meat quality from gate to plate. He is particularly well known for his research on game meat, and exotic meat specifically, with its contribution to international knowledge recognized when he was awarded the American Meat Science International Lectureship Award in 2013. In 2018, however, he made a major career leap and traded the African bushveld for the Australian outback. It did not take him too long to discover new hunting grounds as meat scientist at the University of Queensland in Australia. He also holds the title of Professor Emeritus at the Department of Animal Sciences of Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Louw, we look forward to your account on how meat research has developed over the years.
Right, thanks for inviting me, and it's good to see a number of old friends and old faces, both Hero and Clyde, as well as some of the people introducing the speakers. So I thought I would spend time to talk a bit about where meat science came from, particularly with a focus on meat quality and what the meat science world was up to in the past, present, and do a bit of looking into the looking glass in the future. So if we look at the early 1900s, at that stage, labor and meat was very cheap. It didn't cost a lot to have someone working for you or a lab technician, and to get some carcasses to do research on was very cheap. So, but there was, on the other side, there was very little pressure on academia or researchers to publish. So the research that was being conducted was driven by researchers who had an inherent search for knowledge. And there's a lot of blue skies research and also a lot of curiosity-driven science behind it. So it was academia, professors who sat in the office and thought a lot and had time to think, and then they didn't need a lot of financial resources to be able to do the work. And in the early years, as Hero has said in his presentation, there was a lot of focus around the animal husbandry side, and basically to improve the production efficiency of the production of livestock per se. And the focus was on the growth, reproduction, and the development within different species, and different species, the suitability for meat production per se. The other action there was also, of course, in connection with the improved efficient production systems, was also mitigation of diseases and parasites. But I'm not going to be talking about that. And one of the key questions that the scientists were asking themselves is a calf a miniature cow or not? And then they were also comparing differences between different species. What makes a sheep and a goat different, or a sheep and a cow and a pig different? So that was the main focus of the research. Also in the early 1900s, we started the process where people started having livestock shows to compare each other's animals, live animals. And then there was also the beginning of the development of a meat packing industry, where you going away from a home self-slaughter, self-consumption, together with the Industrial Revolution of people moving into towns. You now had to start bringing the food to the people in the cities, and that's where the meatpacking industry came. And at the same time, then with that, the whole international trade in meat was developing, and there was a need to standardize the meat trade cuts, because if I was exporting at that stage, I know the British colonies were exporting meat into Britain, but they had different cuts. So you needed to develop a language that the industry per se understood when you spoke about a cut, the eye muscle. What exactly was the eye muscle? And it had different terms and different terminology and different areas within the body. So you needed to standardize that. The other interesting one was there was some research, and it's still ongoing, around the logistics of moving carcasses around the world. Because suddenly at that stage, although the figure on the left shows aeroplane, air, it was mainly internationally between continents using ships. And that was a whole new requirement around there. Clyde mentioned 4 weeks lambs on board the ship. It's only with the COVID epidemic that people started looking at using planes for high value cuts and export of that. So as I mentioned in the earlier, there were this move to standardize the cuts of beef carcasses. This was photos taken of the Netherlands and Polish different cuts. And you can see there was on the left-hand side subtle differences in the different cuts and the naming of the cuts. And that then led to, on the right-hand side, international codes that were used that defined exactly what and where a cut would be made. And that is to facilitate the trade so that when you're exporting, everyone speaks the same term and the same terminology. Around this time, the research focus was on the growth and development of animals and their growth rate. And we all know that the classical where the growth starts at the extremities, moves upwards, then comes to the center and then moves into the belly of the animal, which is very typical. And in the sigmoidal growth curve, this where it ends up in the belly is when you start reaching the plateau. And at the same time, understanding this growth allowed us to start selecting pigs from the left-hand side, which is a more wild boar type of body, to one that's a typical modern pig. And during this stage, the scientists were also working out the change in specific cuts relative to the whole carcass body weight. So for example, this sheep on the back, it's got 139. So that means that that weight increased 39% faster than it did, say, in the shoulder. And you also found these classical growth curves developed for high diet, low diet, early maturing, late maturing, and 1, 2, 3, 4, indicating the different, the central nervous system, bones, muscle, fat, and or the different fat depots. They all follow the same system where the rates they increase, reach a point, and they decrease. And at the whole time, the drive behind this was to get a more meaty animal. And then around 1930s to 50s, the focus of the researchers changed to meat and carcass quality. And a lot of this interest was led by the classic contributions of Hammond, Brodie, and others, as well as meat scientists and animal nutritionists around the 1950s. And what happened then, there was a positive belief that the role of fat played in consumer acceptability, organic leptic properties and quality of meat products. Also remember, this is around the two wars as well, and fat was then still seen as a good source of energy. Eero mentioned there in his talk about the early people who consumed the fat for energy, and that was still the issue around the 50s after the Second World War. And there was also a realization that dietary finishing programs of the animals in feedlots or in intensive production systems, poultry or pigs, would ensure adequate animal fattening to promote product quality as it was then defined. And remember, then it was defined as an animal that has a reasonable amount of subcutaneous fat. And this, in my earlier slide, I spoke about comparison of species. And that was also one of the focuses was, why does a pig carcass have more subcutaneous fat of its total fat depot, a higher percentage subcutaneous fat than a lamb, and that which is more than a beef? And that's obviously, we now know it's part of the different genes that are activated and of species differences. But these consumers and fat, the human nutritionists, as well as the animal scientists who were looking at diets, that brought together both meat scientists and nutritionists to study the effects of various factors affecting carcass composition. And then later in time, physiologists and endocrinologists joined the research efforts to promote basically the efficiency of meat production and to improve carcass quality. But this was reported on by scientists such as Bratzler in 1954, although he's better known for his the development of the Warner-Bratzler apparatus to measure tenderness in meat. So also around the 1950s, the as scientific analytical techniques developed, the focus changed to a cellular level because we now started developing stronger analytical tools as well as microscopes, and we moved into the muscle biology area. And questions that were beginning to be asked were around muscle contraction, fiber types, rigor mortis development and resolution via enzymes. And then another group of scientists were actually asking questions about the prediction of carcass composition, because suddenly labor was becoming more expensive, carcasses more expensive, and we didn't have the time available or the resources to take a whole carcass and dissect the whole carcass and measure individual muscles and break that down into fat collagenous tissue. So people were beginning to say, but can't we find an area in the carcass that we can analyze, and that will be representative of the whole carcass? But of course, this area and what it represents all depends on how it goes and develops on that earliest slide that I showed with the sheep and the growth curves. And we still need to take that into account. At the moment, most of the animals are normally slaughtered at a young age, just not far after they've reached the inflection point on the sigmoidal growth curve. And one of the cuts that was used as a prediction was the 3-rib cut, the 9th, 11th rib or the 8th, 9th, 10th rib that was developed. And this came from the need for good representation of the entire carcass composition. And actually, in fact, in 1927, the 3-rib cut was proposed, and the Bureau of Animal Industry undertook the first study for the suitability of purpose. And this was also reported by Hankins and Howe in 1946 in their book entitled Estimation of the Composition of Beef Carcasses and Cuts. During this period, there was also a focus that started moving on to the nutritional and health quality of meat, which started developing. What's interesting, around the 1950s, there was also research around the processing and use of hybrid or plant proteins meat in cheaper processed products that was being developed. And in 1943, Kellogg made the first soy-based meat analog, which they called soy protose, and that contained 32% soya. If you study research over a long period, you'll see that it moves in circles. Each time the circle comes around, our knowledge of what we're studying increases, and we get more in depth because of our technological expertise of what the tools that we use to analyze our product changes. But the cow today is very similar to a cow 1,000 years ago, although we may have changed slightly, but in our selection for early maturing versus late maturing. And then at the same time, the communication and the influence of from the producers and the consumers started playing a role, and they started interaction. And this is again a trend in modern time. So it's not a new concept to go back to say, what does the consumer want? But I'll talk a bit more about what the consumer wants. Clyde also touched on that. And what happened then, there was also a move from a clean label trend where you had 1 or 2 basic things to a more highly processed alternatives with a whole list of regulations and a whole list of information that needs to be available. So around the 1970s, 80s, the microbiological research expanded because of public food concerns, and we started seeing a stronger cohort of meat scientists with microbiological training that started becoming active in this area. And the importance of food poisoning topics started coming out: salmonellosis, Clostridium perfringens, botulism, staphylococcus. Interesting to note that in the 1990s, E. coli 015787 provided the motivation for the initiation of HACCP. And actually, HACCP originated from the space travel, where they were stuck with this problem, this issue, this challenge of sending astronauts into outer space with food, but they had to make sure that the food was safe to consume, because you couldn't afford to have an astronaut get food poisoning whilst in outer space. And they then said, well, how do we know? We can't test the food. So then they started bringing in good manufacturing processes to say, well, where can there be possible contamination? What steps can we do to stop it? And that's where this whole issue came from. At the same time, in the late 1980s, small abattoirs started merging into larger abattoirs, and the slaughter process became more streamlined. And these slaughter processes increased, the magnitude, mechanization became more common. And then also food engineering started playing a large role. Eero mentioned some of the first food engineering was the creation of sausages, but that now became even more so. So we started getting restructured products, and that's quite common in modern society, although we don't always realize it is. If you just think of any hamburger patty or any chicken burger, the chicken burger, basically, if it's got a crumb structure, it was most probably reconstructed because this facilitated the ease of making same portion sized products. And then also in the late 1980s, heart disease concerns surfaced around saturated fatty acids and cholesterol. Ironically, you don't see any research anymore around cholesterol value of meat and how to manipulate it, because we now know that's not really an issue, the cholesterol in the meat per se. Post 2000, we're now moving into an automation and prediction of quality has become the norm. Clyde spoke about that part of it, and it's ensuring the consistent product quality for the retailer that he can sell to the consumer. So we ended up with warm carcasses with decreased meat quality, that is cold shorting, as Clyde mentioned, with a need to focus on improving the quality, and that's where electrical stimulation spray chilling came in, as well as the cold storage per se. When we still had these small abattoirs, their cooling facility wasn't that efficient. And then later, when it moved to the larger processing plant that I spoke about in the previous slide, the cooling efficiency was, again, not that efficient. And they used to have these corridors called pre-chilling corridors, where they slowly cooled the carcasses down before putting them into the chiller. As the engineers have come aboard and we've increased the efficiency of our chillers and started using spray chilling as well, we are able to chill down a carcass very rapidly. And then, as Clyde mentioned in his talk, that's the need where electrical stimulation came in. And I think one of the main issues now is food safety, as well as how can we extend shelf life extension, and that's where smart packaging comes in. So in our modern day, the focus is more and more on the logistics and the challenges faced at logistics. How does Australia, New Zealand move their products, or South America, their products into the EU and still maintain quality and safety? And the whole logistics, I think we've all seen now with the issues going on in Europe between Russia and the other countries, how important logistics of the food chain is. I think also mechanization and automation is here to stay, but it also has its challenges. If you have a look at the latest Animal Frontiers that came out about a week ago, number 17, the second version, there's a number of good papers that give an overview around the automation. The other move that's happening now is there's a move in the big companies to try and maximize the yields, particularly the fifth quarter. And they're looking at value adding and using byproducts. People are going back to say, well, what else can we get out of bones? Because remember the carcass and bone meal with the mad cow disease, the prion, that whole market closed down. So now they're going back and saying, well, is there something we could do? Is there protein or not? When in the 80s, it was common practice to crush the bones under a high pressure and to get the marrow and the some of the sources of meat that came out of that, to get that into emulsion products. That's why in some countries, the regulation of cheaper sausages, one of the regulations is a maximum limit of calcium, and that's because of the use of mechanically recovered meat or mechanically deboned meat, which has a higher portion of calcium in it, that you don't have too much of that. Food safety is becoming a bigger issue, as I said, but with food safety comes smart packaging, where your package starts telling you what's happening. The carbon footprint is definitely a issue that's now being debated, and the argument against animal meat. But it was mentioned in Euro's reply. There are some numbers of studies that have come out looking at life cycle analysis of the different types of meat that are produced and shown on the long term, because of the need for electricity at the moment and the processes, that your fermented meat vat that you use to make your artificial meat isn't necessarily less or more carbon efficient than livestock is. We've also moved back again to plant-based meat analogs or alternatives. We're also looking at super chilled the meat. We can now move our meat around at super chilled -2 degrees Celsius and it's still fresh. But I find there's also an information overload and social influence on what's happening. We keep saying that the consumer wants to know all this information, but does the consumer have time when they're doing their shopping to assimilate all the information? I saw the other day one of the latest technologies where you have cameras that follow the hands of the consumer with a big screen above the display cabinet where the meat products are. So if the consumer picks up a T-bone steak, immediately the camera identifies the meat product he's holding up, and in front of him comes a screen showing where it comes from the animal, showing the history, who produced it, and a recipe of how to cook it. But again, the question is, with our move away of people wanting to, on the way from home, to stop to pick up food to consume, that's not an overload for the people. So the other thing in modern day, the color, taste, eating experience and credits attributes to branding has resulted in a lot of niche markets and products. And there's also a move to buy local for shorter supply chain. But with this comes the research around what's the desirable response versus an economic response. I just before leaving South Africa, I did a study on one of the main supermarkets around organic produced chicken versus chicken that was produced intensively. And I had students stand outside the supermarket with a questionnaire and ask the shoppers, if you had a choice between organic versus intensively reared, and the organic was more expensive, which would you buy? And they said organic. We would thank them, and then they walked into the supermarket, and unbeknown to them, another student would follow to see what they put into the basket. And they kept, each time they put in the cheaper product in the basket. And that's what I call a social desirable response versus the economic response. No one is going to admit, I don't care two stuffs whether the chicken is raised intensively or free range, because who wants to be perceived to be non-caring about animal welfare? But when I'm in the shop and no one looks at me, I face the reality and I buy the cheaper product. So I sometimes wonder this, are we focusing too much on consumer perception? But linked to that, who influences that perception? Clyde, I think, mentioned it. In my mind, the supermarkets are the ones that are in the middle. They're influencing the consumer because they're doing a lot of marketing, and then they're pushing back to the producer and the processor and saying, this is what the consumer wants. As an example, I had a PhD student who looked at increasing the slaughter weight of pigs, because we looked at the sigmoidal growth curve of the pigs, and over time with the selection for leaner carcasses, we felt we could get good food conversion ratio and at a heavier carcass and still have a lean pig carcass. So, and that was so. So instead of slaughtering a 100 kg pig, we were slaughtering a 130 kg pig carcass, which was great. And then the supermarket turned around and said, no, the consumer doesn't want this bacon because they say the eye of the bacon is too big. And I could never understand it because I never saw any research being done on consumer preferences for the size of the bacon. Until one day I was standing in front of the refrigerator and I realized that if the larger bacon was to be packaged and placed in the refrigerator, where the refrigerator could take 6 normal sized bacon packs and it would be full, it could now only take 5 1/4. And it was actually a decision made on the economics of space utilization in the fridge inside the shop. but was tagged to a consumer perception. The other question that I have is culture diversity of the consumer taken into account in all our research? 90% of the research that's been done in meat science has been done on intact fresh meat, the high valued cuts. But we all know the high value cuts is we're lucky if we get 45% of a carcass that we can push into high value cuts. And in the developing world, where there's a growth in meat demand, they don't necessarily consume fresh cuts, but actually they consume tougher cuts. And a lot of times they don't have any refrigeration, so they consume their meat pre-rigor. Yet we focus on post-rigor and we focus on tenderizing. And so the question is, how do we define quality in a global context? I recall years attending ICOMS conferences with some of my colleagues, African colleagues, and after we've had, in my mind, a delicious fillet steak at the dinner, they would come to me and say, "Lo, let's go and get some proper nyama, proper meat, that stuff that we can chew on." A paper was published beginning of this year that showed that the Chinese consumers prefer darker beef. And that was because they are used to beef that most probably is DFD. And they would prefer a darker colored beef than what we have. So we've got to be careful when we look at these actions. So I thought I would just quickly stop and just mention some of the interventions that I think changed the meat industry, influenced the meat industry dramatically. I think one of those is the more humane slaughter process with a higher welfare, carbon dioxide use in pigs and chickens, with Patricia Bartengade's work in the beginning in Europe that really gave a push to the carbon dioxide slaughtering methodology in pigs. And this also allowed for batch slaughtering, so we could process more animals at a time. I think the other one that was a big change as well was electrical stunning. And then I didn't know that actually that Clyde was going to talk here, but I think electrical stimulation, as example, as discussed by Clyde, was also a big changer, because in other developing countries, it allows the meat from a carcass to reach the consumer within 4 days post-mortem and still be tender. And the implication of this is that the company that does the processing doesn't have to keep meat for a long period in the refrigeration. So he has a better cash flow because there's not a lot of money lying in the cold storage. In Europe, it's slightly different with the processed pigs. The hams, sometimes some places in Europe and some of the slaughterhouses are used to having a product 6 to a year on the shelf before selling it. But obviously that also has a higher cost. So other interventions that changed the meat industry, I think a major one was vacuum packaging and modified atmospheric packaging, although the latter is on the way out. And I think there's also active intelligent packing or alternative packaging that's now moving in with this whole more eco-friendly packaging using chitosan derived from insects and or decapods, different creatures, to try and have a more biodegradable packaging. But it's always a challenge with meat, isn't it? Because meat is a high moisture content, so you need a package that won't deteriorate rapidly with the moisture, but over time it will still break down. And then I think the other one is the shelf life indicator on the packaging. So some of the conclusions at the moment, Clyde also spoke about this. Farmers are being paid based on carcass quality, but what about meat quality? As far as I know, in the world, Meat Standards Australia is the only country that actually pays a producer for the eating quality. They have a whole group of cuts that are prepared in different ways, and then are tested by consumer panels, not a trained taste panel, but consumer panels, to give ratings. And then they take those and they come back and have rating scores where they look at pH, where they look at the use or not of growth hormone stimulants. They look at the Bos indicus level in the carcass, if it was feedlotted or not, and an ossification rather than teeth as a physiological age indicator, fat levels, and a whole bunch of other indicators to try and give a meat quality standard. But process still face challenges when it comes to automation. You know, you might have a computer and smartware that tells you exactly how to cut the carcass to maximize the yield. But one of the challenges then you need more and more uniform carcasses to go through with these robotics, which is quite easy with pigs and with chickens, less so when you start having free-range cattle or sheep that come off the pastures. I think something that we're aware of, but as meat scientists, we haven't really thought much, and I'm doing a bit of work with colleagues around that, and that's the integration of the data and various systems along the supply chain and the safety of the data on the cloud. You just need to see what happened to JBS beginning of the year when they were hacked and had to pay a penalty to get their data back, and JBS was hacked in South America, but all of the abattoirs all over the world were closed down. The other one is in developing nations, the progress is slower, but that again of the automation, it means that it's still job creation that side and cheap labor. I also think one of the challenges is defining meat quality on a global context, and we need to consider culture and behavior of various consumers into account. I think some of the realities, the first world farmer, he's worried about greenhouse gases, welfare, automation, quality, and quality of life, whilst the developing world farmer, he's worried about diseases, sustainability, and reproduction. And he has a threat of globalization, political corruption, and then we also have non-meat products. But the reality is we have a large surface area of the world that we can't grow crops on. There's not enough water, so we can only use ruminants on those properties. So I think that these non-meat products is not a threat to the meat industry. It's actually complementary, because we can't produce enough meat to feed the people, the growth in population that's expected in 2050. And it's the large meat processing industries have realized that. That's why they have all bought shares into these non-meat, meat-like product companies that develop the products. I think personally that hybrid between meat and replacing some of the meat with some of the other protein sources is the way of the future. I think that's where we should be focusing our research at the moment. And with that, Sarah, I'd like to thank you and the audience for allowing me this opportunity.